Evaluation, cognitive view of language. As you would remember that whenever we evaluate an approach, like we did earlier, we always look at how that approach views the language itself, the language learning process itself, and what is the view of the learner that they hold. So keeping that in mind again, let us look at what do the cognitivists, theorists, look at language, or how do they explain the language. So the basic thing over here is that the cognitivist theorists, or those working within the cognitive approaches, do not say much about language at all. They just see it as an information, a complex set of information, and they concentrate mainly on the study of how that information is processed in the minds of the second language learner when they try to acquire it. And they also focus on the constraints that are there that they might confront when they are learning a language, as you would remember is done by the perceptual saliency hypothesis. So language is, in this cognitivist view, is seen as a set of patterns. If you take up this approach of connectionism, if within that they see language as not even rule governed, they see it as a set of patterns that is picked up by the learners through making some associations with their former language. They argue that this set of patterns that is picked up by the learners through associations or through developing certain connections with the new knowledge is strengthened in the mind of the learner through repeated activation. So the more they use it and the more their knowledge is activated, the same patterns are repeated again and again. So as we talk about cognitivist approaches and we are discussing about their view of language holistically, but within the cognitive approaches are also different theories. So slightly there might be differences in how they view the language. And over here, when we talked about this language as being a set of patterns, we specifically talked about this in relation to the connectionist approach or theory. In any case, whatever the approach might be, the methodological approaches that are taken up to study the processes in the mind are based on laboratories. So whatever happens or whatever is studied more often than not, they are likely to be studied in controlled laboratory research environment. So small fragments of either artificial languages which are generated by the computer or small fragments of real languages are used to come up with certain hypotheses. So it hardly ever studies language in real life situations. So the critique is that it looks at only this fragmentary parts of the language. For it, the language then appears in clinical environment, and the view of the language that emerges might only be fragmentary because they are not taking into account all the different aspects of language that are there in real life situations. It also totally ignores the social and linguistic phenomena around. It hardly talks about the relationships between teachers and students and how would that, for instance, affect the learning of the language, the peer pressure. It is simply not concerned with that. It is only concerned with how specific parts of language are learnt by the learner. So, for instance, one of the shortcomings of their connectionist model is that it does not explain the mental grammar constraints affecting the hypothesis that the learners formulate in the mind. So if they say there is a certain kind of a hypothesis that the learners come up with, and some certain kind of associations that they make with other information, they simply do not explain what are the constraints on that pattern making, those association making things. They do not explain that. So the phenomena that has yet to be explained by cognitive approaches are that the development route of second language learning. They still need to explain the full developmental route of second language learning. Although if you think about the teachability hypothesis that we talked about, they do talk about which structures to be taught in what way, but then they are only talking about certain aspects or short fragments of language. They do not lay out a full, complete learning route of the second language learning. And they also still have to explain how highly complex linguistic forms or structures are acquired. So this is because they have only limited themselves to partial aspects of language. So yes, cognitive approaches to learning are very useful, yet the way they see language or they view language learning, it is quite limited in scope.